Hey, we are finishing up. Well, we're continuing chapter 29. I'll do my best to get through it as quickly as possible. I know I may be going too fast for you to do um, writing as I speak. I'm going to do my best to give you enough information so that you don't feel like you're being like I'm going a little too fast. But keep in mind that if you don't pick up every single note, you can always go back and look at the lecture again. That's fine. But we need to get through things as quickly as possible because we are running out of time, which is a good problem to have, actually, at the end of the school year. Okay, so we were talking about the civil rights movement. Of all of the black leaders in the civil rights movement, no one has matched the stature of Martin Luther King Jr. in people's minds. So when they look at him, when they think of the civil rights movement, he is the person that most people think of during that time. And he even is celebrated with his own holiday in January. King insisted on nonviolent demonstrations to end discrimination. And remember, we already talked about where he came up with that idea, using the patterns of both Christ and Gandhi in that to use nonviolent methods. It protected his people. That's what he was looking at as well. He is famous for his saying, don't let anyone pull you so low as to hate them. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated by a gunman who used the violent atmosphere of the South to justify his own racism. This is a picture immediately before his death and then immediately after. It was unexpected, but this was one in many assassinations that were taking place during the 1960s. When people make a comment like 50 years ago, things were so much better, I'm always just kind of shocked by that thought process because 50 years ago, we were having assassinations. Cults were huge. The civil rights movement was in play. You're talking about a lot of bad things that were happening 50 years ago, but people have this, they tend to romanticize the past. Just like, it's no different than people who go to like Renaissance fairs and try to pretend like they're old timey and they don't realize how incredibly awful the Renaissance actually was. And the Renaissance fairs aren't even about the Renaissance, they're about the Middle Ages, which is a little different. So anyway, it was MLK's dream, and we talked about his dream speech, that someday people would be judged by their character rather than the color of their skin. And that phraseology that he used comes directly from Romans 2:11. There is no respect of persons with God. In Acts, the same author, Paul, talks about we are all of one blood. We are all of one race of people. So there is no biblical standard that preaches or teaches racism ever. Now, while JFK was still the U.S. president, the United States began sending soldiers to South Vietnam. Before that, it was Eisenhower. He sent people who were there to coach the South Vietnamese on how to handle being attacked by North Vietnam. North Vietnam was sneaking people in through an underground series of tunnels called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And they were terrorizing the people of South Vietnam in an effort to weaken them, to compel them to want to embrace communism, which North Vietnam was being run by a communist dictator at the time. So Eisenhower sent in people to help, but it was mostly to give information. JFK is going to be the first one to send in soldiers, and it won't be a lot of soldiers at the very beginning, and it's primarily to protect the people of South Vietnam, not necessarily to fight against North Vietnam. Okay. The domino theory was the terminology that was being used during this time. This was the idea that if one Asian country fell to communism, that the rest would follow. And you'll notice that the dominoes actually start with Vietnam. If we really wanted to use this domino theory, you could use China as an example. China fell first. And then from China, they went into Korea. Remember, China was actually offering aid to North Korea, and now Vietnam. So it's just taking a long time. This is going on over a long period of time. But we see communism actually destroying each country it's part of, and yet it spreads, and people who aren't affected by communism are the ones who are pro-communism. It's really crazy. The third world began to be used, the idea of a first world, second world, third world, and it had to do with the economic advantages of each country or each section of the world. So the first world was seen as highly economically savvy and safe. Okay, if you look at the map, all of these first world countries have free enterprise. It's that simple. They have a system of free enterprise that allows people to work as they see fit. So it gives them the freedom to work. That's what enterprise is. And it allows them to trade freely amongst each other. For the second world nations, there's usually what we call a mix, a command economy where the government runs a majority of things, and a mix of command economy and free enterprise. There's usually a mix there, but usually in that mix, the government is the primary business runner. And then in the third world, you really have a distinct difference between the people who are making all the decisions and the people who are doing the work. There is not a lot of freedom in third world countries for people to just become economically sound or savvy based on their own actions. They are so under the thumb and under the control of their leadership that they really cannot promote themselves into a good economy. Okay, and it's really sad. It's awful. Most of the third world nations are either communist, flat out communist, or they are what we call socialist. Okay, they might call themselves republics, but they have socialist policies. Okay, for China and Russia, you'll notice that they're part of the second world. They have the leadership actually lives as if they are capitalists, but they are using slave labor, which is not capitalistic at all. In a capitalist society, slave labor does not exist. Some people use that term that, we shouldn't like capitalism because capitalism started the slave trade. That is not accurate at all. In capitalism, it's all about a voluntary exchange of goods. Okay, so when we talk about slavery in the United States, those slave states were not part of a capitalist system. They were a part of it was more of a feudal system, honestly, that they tried to recreate the Middle Ages feudal system. So they weren't really capitalist at all. And they were behind on every single element when it came to agriculture, literature, theology. They were far, far behind everybody else. They were actually second world. Okay. We only ever see like the shanties that the slaves lived in or the huge plantation homes that the slave owners lived in, but we don't see the majority of people in the South were actually living like second world citizens. Okay, in 1964, the North Vietnamese Navy allegedly attacked American ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. It is still up for debate exactly what happened because you will have people on both sides declaring that what they say is true. According to North Vietnam, the ships were in the North Vietnamese waters. They had no right to be there. People who were on board those American ships said that they were fired upon. And then other people who were on board the American ship said, no, we weren't. And there's no evidence that we were fired upon. Those who said they were fired upon showed like little ricochet marks, but there's no bullet holes. But so it was kind of up in the air. What exactly happened here? We honestly don't know. It's still up in the air. But LBJ, the president, after Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson, he's going to use this instance to increase military presence in the South. There is an old saying that flops around every once in a while, and you may have heard it: never let a crisis go to waste. And this is all about trying to get as much government control as possible by using a crisis to manipulate the population. This is LBJ's chance to take a crisis and manipulate it to get his own way. He wanted to get the United States out of Vietnam, but he wanted to do it with a victory. And there was no chance at victory with the way things were set up at the time. His only way of victory was to go to the Congress and have them declare a war on Vietnam, and then go in with all the firepower that we had, destroy North Vietnam and get our men out. That would be it. That was the only way to win this war. The Congress did not want to have any part of Vietnam. They disagreed with it from the inception of people going in and just being advisors, and they refused to give LBJ the go-ahead to declare war. They refused to do it. Now, Lyndon B. Johnson was later asked why our ships were where they were, and he said, sometimes presidents just say stupid things. What can you say? But he said that is, for all he knew, our Navy was out there shooting whales. It's like, that's just a dumb thing to say. I mean, don't say stuff like that. I mean, that's just idiotic. He's going to use this as an excuse to try to get funding for the war. So the Vietnam War, even though it is called the Vietnam War, is technically never declared by Congress. This is the biggest problem. The president could say, this is a state of emergency. This is a police action. I will send troops to Vietnam. He's allowed to do that. But because war was not declared, it did not release the monies that was absolutely necessary for war equipment and personnel, honestly. So there was 500,000 American soldiers shipped off to Vietnam to defend freedom in an absolutely no-win conflict. There was no way we could actually take out North Vietnam without the proper guns, bullets, bombs, whatever else were needed. Our soldiers fought bravely, but they were not allowed to win. Congress was still involved with this idea of just push back the communists over their border and everything will be okay, even though the communists from North Vietnam were using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, this underground tunnel system, to invade South Vietnam, and they were doing it repeatedly. There was no pushing them back. It was not going to happen. So the Vietnam War police action actually went through 5 different presidencies. Way drug out, way too long, and it was not a popular war, not among the American people. Even those who were incredibly patriotic, who believed our service people could do anything, they were frustrated at the way it was being handled on the home front, because this was a war actually being run by politicians, not by the military. Okay, the Tet Offensive. This was a series of devastating battles that were begun by the Viet Cong. That is North Korea. Nope. Let's try that again. North Vietnam. The Viet Cong was the communist group. They used their tunnels. They used the border. They just marched right into to the areas of South Vietnam, and they just started shooting everybody indiscriminately. The American embassy was attacked. That in itself is a declaration of war. Congress still would not release the monies to arm our people. So even though Viet Cong absolutely declared war by attacking our embassy, they still didn't get everything that they needed. The Viet Cong just took to the streets in South Vietnam. Now, in the bottom picture on the left, there is the guy who took the photograph was somebody who had been working with the chief of police in the city in South Vietnam. He knew the chief of police very, very well. He knew how the man felt about his men. The chief of police had a very strong connection with the men who worked for him in the police department. When they were attacked during the Tet Offensive, the military and the police forces all went out to try to stop this bloodshed. I mean, we're talking about not even military attacks. We're talking about murders on the citizenry of South Vietnam. Okay. The chief of police and his men, they actually caught the man who's wearing like the plaid shirt. He is Viet Cong. You notice he's not dressed in uniform. He was one of the guys who was like dressed in plain clothes, and he was attacking people. He was attacking citizens. He attacked multiple citizens and shot and killed a couple of the chief of police's officers. As a result, the chief of police executed the man in the street. That's what happened. The guy who took the picture knew the frustration and the sadness and everything that was going on before this picture. And he sent a message to the magazine he worked for and explained the whole story. But instead of giving everybody the background of what was going on, the magazine instead, I believe it was Life magazine, instead presented the picture with almost no relevant information. Instead, they twisted the story to make it sound like the guy from South Vietnam was the bad guy. And here he had arrested a poor, look at this guy. He's not even in uniform and he's got his hands behind his back. Obviously, he can't defend himself. And this guy from South Vietnam just walks up and puts a bullet in his brain. Who would do that kind of thing? Bunch of monsters. That is not what happened in this story at all. In fact, the police chief from South Vietnam was so well loved by the people of South Vietnam and the Americans he worked with as he was a buffer between the military and the citizenry, that when it came time for evacuating South Vietnam, he was encouraged to come to the United States of America, where he became a pizza parlor owner in Virginia. Can't make this stuff up. Congress refused to allow needed military action, but American and South Vietnamese forces managed to hold communists back. But it was going to be bloody, very, very bloody war, and very horrific war. Never really knew from one day to the next where the next attack was going to come from. As a result, a lot of our military personnel became incredibly depressed, very frustrated. They weren't being supported at home. They weren't being supported by the politicians who demanded they be the ones to run the war. They didn't know who their friends were, who their enemies were, because South Vietnam and North Vietnam, the people look exactly the same as in Korea. So it was like, how do you tell who's your enemy and who's your friend? And as a result, you had a lot of rebellion and a lot of frustration among the military vets in Vietnam, and a lot of men turned to drinking and drugs as a result of it. It's self-medicating, and we've seen that before with Second World War. Another big problem with the war in Vietnam was how it was portrayed to the American people. Life magazine, again, really, really tarnished the reputations of our soldiers in South Vietnam. I'm not saying they were all perfect, not even close to that, but there was a practice of North Vietnamese soldiers, Viet Cong, there we go, among the Viet Cong, to capture children. And this happened early on. They would capture children because they knew American soldiers would reach out to little kids. And so they would capture these little kids and they would strap bombs onto them or grenades or whatever, and they would send them into crowds full of American soldiers. The American soldiers they have always done this where they have pulled a Hershey bar out of their pocket, handed it to a kid, and then once there was a group of American soldiers around a kid, the bomb would go off and it would kill the soldiers. So it became a policy among some soldiers, because they had watched their friends get blown to bits, that they started shooting kids when they started approaching them, especially kids that were unaccompanied. And those are the pictures that made it into Life magazine, without, again, proper explanation that this was not something that these men wanted to do, but they did it because they were fearful for their lives and for the lives of their men. It's a horrific thing that there's no good in this. There is no good side. There was no, well, they did the right thing or they did no, there's no good in this at all. To use children like that is abominable. You can just imagine why so many of our Vietnam vets came back with a lot of emotional baggage because of everything they went through while in Vietnam. Some conservatives felt that communist sympathizers in high-ranking government positions were deliberately hindering the United States military's ability for achievement for victory in Vietnam, and they're absolutely right. And it wasn't just those in high-ranking government positions, although they existed, but it was also in the media and in Hollywood. There were a lot of communist sympathizers who were on the side of Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam. So those people who were on the side of the communists are going to go after the American soldiers. They don't know what the American soldiers' political stance is at this time, but they are going to assume that every American soldier that is in Vietnam was a bad guy, and they're going to treat them horribly when they come home. Okay, Daniel Chappie James became a general. He distinguished himself in Korea and then flew 78 combat missions in Vietnam as well. He was our first, I believe he was the first full general. He was the first black full general. Before that, we had a brigadier general, which I believe is a rank just below that. But he was the first full on. I'm pretty sure it's on the next note. Let's find out. First black man in the U.S. history is to achieve the rank of 4-star general. There we go. Okay, here's a little bit of trivia for you for when you're playing, trivia and game night or whatever. The highest ranking military officer ever in U.S. history, George Washington. The reason for that is because every time a general breaks the record for how many stars he gets, like for instance, this guy's a 4-star general. You can also have a 5-star general, but every time somebody gets to the equal rank of whatever George Washington holds, they bump George Washington up another star. So he is always the highest ranking military person in U.S. history. Always. Won't change. See? Good trivia. Okay, during the Vietnam years, patriotism hit an all-time low in America, and a lot of that was because of our media. A lot of it was because of Hollywood, and a lot of it was because of our government, okay, and the way they treated this war in Vietnam. So liberal and rebellious young people on college campuses were being taught by liberal and rebellious teachers on college campuses across the United States, and they demonstrated against the war. Sometimes those became violent demonstrations. Sometimes it was because the demonstrators themselves were violent against people, but in some cases there were accidents, unfortunately, that resulted in people's deaths. The Peace Corps that was sent out to a lot of these college campuses to prevent people who weren't part of the war demonstration from getting hurt, and to prevent violence from actually taking place on campus. They were always armed with rubber bullets, but there were a couple of cases, unfortunately, where there was live ammunition in the guns and people died as a result. Okay. Some protesters burned U.S. flags to demonstrate their defiance and hatred towards America because they didn't agree with what was going on in Vietnam. And so they wanted to hate all of America, and they wanted America to be communist. Okay, this is still the communist influence. Many college students and professors openly avowed communist belief or sympathy. You can't really blame people for not being very bright when it comes to what communism is and what it does when their teachers are telling them that it's a good thing. You would hope that after a while people would just start studying on their own and they would teach themselves, but that's not always happening. I feel like I'm all loppy here. Okay, college campuses were plagued with riots, war protests, flag burning, and other anti-American activities. And many times the violence was the protesters themselves being violent. Some young men dodged the draft. They were supposed to register when they were 18. Some of them just refused to register. Others took off and they moved to other countries. You actually have that right as an American citizen to just leave the country. It's fine. But they moved to other countries so they wouldn't have to fight. This started this rise in an American subculture that they like to call a counterculture. We aren't cultural at all. We are the opposite of culture. When you think about what culture is, it's the way of a group of people. It's a way of life of a group of people. The hippies wanted to be counterculture. They wanted to be the opposite of the way of life of a group of people. I don't think you can actually do that in practice, but what they did is they took all of the things that the United States saw as part of U.S. culture and the way we live our lives, and they tried to do the opposite of that. Okay? So they turned to drugs because you weren't supposed to take drugs. And they turned to immoral lifestyles because you were only supposed to sleep with the person you're married to. They went without bathing. Yeah, that was a thing. The cultural norm is to take a bath, then I'm not going to take a bath. Dad, burn it. Oh, yucky. They wore dirty, ragged, unconventional clothing, and they deliberately broke all codes of politeness and manners, including pooping on the street, which has made a comeback. Weirdly enough, in the same city where the counterculture of hippie lifestyle was actually born, San Francisco. Okay, rock music did play an important part of the hippie movement because a lot of rock stars were actually hippies. It had a great influence over the hippies and vice versa. And many of the rock musicians the hippies followed, belonged to Eastern religious cults, but not all of them did. And not all rock music was rebellious and anti-God. Okay, I think too often we just fall into that point and go, oh, rock music is bad. You got to pay attention to who's singing and what they're saying. Okay. Now, when we talk about the term rock and roll, that actually did mean something pretty it meant sex. Okay. And that was among the rhythm and blues musicians. They used that term as a shortcut for sex, rock and roll. And the first time it was used on the radio, the majority of Americans did not realize that was considered an impolite term, but the people who were big into R&B were like, oh, did they just say what they said? What I think they said? But the truth is, it's a word that was used and has been reused in a different way. Now it's just a form of music. We don't think of it as being sex, okay? Just like there's a lot of words that we use today that don't mean the exact same thing. When I was growing up, my friends in junior high, we always used the word radical. That was like the slang. And our history teacher was like, well, you know that radical just means fast moving, right? And we're like, okay. We just meant it as cool. Words change over time, but you know this because you have been part of the changing of word culture. Okay, rock and roll no longer means sex. We can just kind of get past that. Okay, sometimes it's referred to that same way by people in the rock and roll industry, but for the most part, it's just a style of music, and we don't need to get ourselves all excited over that. One of the reasons I'm going to be really blunt with you, because I did used to teach that rock and roll was of the devil. And a lot of that was because of the way I was raised. And specifically in high school, when we had in the 80s, there was this huge cultural movement that preached and taught that rock and roll was demon possession. It was influenced by demons. That before rock albums were actually released, there was a special ceremony done by a lot of producers and publishers of music that really consecrated that music to the devil, and that there was a lot of devil worship. In the 80s, everybody was supposed to be a devil worshiper. It was ridiculous. Growing up now and looking back, I'm like, wow, we were taken for a ride. Okay. And it happens a lot of times in closed circles or closed communities because you don't get the outside information ever. What ended up happening, we found out years later, and I mean decades later, that the guy who was the primary source for all that information was just a big liar. He only did that. He only said that kind of stuff and offered that kind of research because he got money when he went to churches and talked about the evils of rock and roll music and encouraged people to burn their rock albums and all this other garbage. And they would take up collections for him, and he'd take the money and go on to the next church and lie through his teeth there. So it was a huge mess that we are still trying to clean up. So we were wrong. So now when I talk about rock and roll music, I'm just saying, pay attention to what they're saying. Skip the songs that are bad, keep the songs that are good. I mean, when it comes to styles of music, I prefer it. I like rock and roll music myself. Okay, I like it a lot better than some stuff. I hate jazz, especially smooth jazz. Give me a break. It just, okay. And I hate the fact that all the 80s music, which I grew up in the 80s, has saxophone in it. Just drives me bananas. But you know what? That's my opinion. That is my prerogative to like or hate the music that I like. You like and hate the music you like. Okay? Go for it. Robert F. Kennedy. This is JFK's brother. Now, JFK had been assassinated in Dallas, Texas. So when LBJ, it was time for him to rerun. I hate to say that, rerun. This makes him sound like he's going to do a dance. But anyway, when it was time for LBJ to try to run again for presidency, he stepped away and he said, I can't do that right now. I'm in the middle of this huge war that is really a police action that Congress won't declare a war. We can't end it. I need to finish this war. I've got to get it out of my hair. So I don't have time to run the country, and especially the Vietnam War, and run for president. So I'm stepping back. Choose somebody else to be your candidate. So JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, was the strongest Democrat contender for the 1968 presidency. So he began to travel throughout the United States. He was with his wife, who was very great with child during this campaign. And again, he was being touted as a family man because he had like 9 kids. I mean, it was just big family. He, touted as being very in love with his wife, good guy. Remember how wonderful JFK was. His brother was a lot like him. Of course, a lot of stuff we find out later, he was just a really good liar. But while he was in California at a big hotel doing his speech for the Democratic National Convention in California, California Convention, he was shot. He was backstage. He had just given his speech. He was backstage and he was exiting, and a man just walked up to him and shot him in the head. At the time, Robert Kennedy was actually talking to the young man who's holding his head up. He was talking to this man. He was a busboy. And he saw everything that happened and pointed out the guy who was running away. That's the guy who shot him. And a football player who was a huge fan of Robert Kennedy and who was there to meet him took off after the guy and tackled him. He did a flying tackle in the kitchen of this hotel. The man who assassinated Robert Kennedy was named Sirhan Bishara Sirhan. And when they asked him why he shot Kennedy, he said because he supported Israel. That was it. That was the reason. Sirhan hated Israel. He didn't like the fact that Robert Kennedy supported Israel. There it is. So Sirhan was a Palestinian Arab with Jordanian citizenship. Remember, they started calling themselves Palestinians after Israel was, going to be established. He was born in Jerusalem, who held strong anti-Zionist beliefs. He said, my determination to eliminate RFK in becoming more and more of an unshakable obsession. RFK must die. RFK must be killed. Robert F. Kennedy must be assassinated. Robert F. Kennedy must be assassinated before June 68, the first anniversary of the start of the Six-Day War between Israel and his Arab neighbors. When Sirhan was booked by police, they found in his pocket a newspaper article that discussed Kennedy's support for Israel. And at his trial, Sirhan testified he began to hate Kennedy after learning of this support. My only connection with Robert Kennedy was his sole support of Israel and his deliberate attempt to send those 550 bombers to Israel to obviously do harm to the Palestinians. That was the reason for him killing the presidential candidate. Now, the Kennedys had a third brother named Teddy Kennedy, but he was not appropriate for the job of president because he had done something really bad and his family didn't want the information to keep popping up. Guess what? It keeps popping up anyway because it was so ridiculously bad. He was at a party with a bunch of his friends and a bunch of women who weren't necessarily married to the married friends that Teddy Kennedy was partying with. Get what I'm going at there? So they were with a bunch of women they weren't married to, and they were having a good old time and getting very, very drunk. Teddy Kennedy and a young woman got into his car. He was driving drunk and he drove off a bridge. He was able to get out of the car. He left her passed out inside the car while he swam to shore, went back home, showered, changed, took a nap, woke up the next day, called the police, and told them that he had driven his car off the bridge the night before, and he thinks that there may have been somebody else inside. For some reason, he was never actually arrested or charged with manslaughter. The Kennedys paid everybody off, and he continued to serve in the U.S. Senate up until almost just before he died. So no, he was never going to become president. It's bad enough he was a senator. Okay, so when we talk about the presidential election of 1968, on the Republican side, there was Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey, Richard M. Nixon, and then Alabama Governor George C. Wallace, who wasn't even part of the Republican Party. He was going to run on a third-party ticket because his whole ticket was bring back segregation. That was his policy. And everybody's just like, okay, you just go sit over there in the corner. We're all just going to pretend you don't exist. Good grief. But they ended up going with Richard Nixon because Nixon was the most popular had the most recognizable name because he had actually debated against Kennedy. So people knew him from TV. So Richard M. Nixon ended up winning the 1960 presidential election. He's from California. So he was a California born president. Okay. I think he's the only one actually born in California that ran for presidency. He was actually born in Yorba Linda, right up the street from us. The Nixon Library is there if you ever want to take a couple hours one day and just go visit it. It's beautiful grounds and everything, but he wasn't exactly the best president. So I have I went a couple times. I went with my family a couple times, and then I took a field trip there once, and I'm like, the whole time I'm there, I'm like, I can't believe I'm bringing students to this library when I really don't like Nixon. But you've got to learn both sides of history, right? I keep telling you that, but you know what? I don't have to do it anymore. So there you go. I'm going to keep learning history, but I don't necessarily have to do any more field trips. So in 1969, astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. His first words were, "That is one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Neil Armstrong. And he's the one all the way on the left, I do believe. Okay, so there were 3 men who went up into space, and I always talk about them because I want all 3 of them to get credit. Oh, I forgot the second one. Okay, so we've got Neil Armstrong was one who went. I believe Alan Shepard was the second guy. The third guy, I always remember, is Buzz Aldrin. Sorry. I should have known that. I just watched 30 Rock where she meets Buzz Aldrin. But the first person on the moon was Neil Armstrong. Buzz Aldrin also joined him. And then there was one guy who was left behind in the lunar module who couldn't leave. He couldn't actually walk on the moon because he was driving the car. So it's kind of funny. This poor guy makes it all the way to the moon, and his whole job is to stay inside and keep the engine running. So I always feel for him. His name is Michael Collins. Same name as a famous revolutionary in Ireland. Okay, pantheism. Oh, in the 60s and 70s, pantheism was huge, especially among the hippies, because the culture in the United States was one God. There is one God. Okay? The Jewish people believe there is one God. The Christian people believe there is one God. Even Muslims believe there is one God. So if you want to do the opposite of what your culture is saying, then you want to believe in a lot of gods, right? So yeah, this became New Age environmentalism. I bet you didn't know that environmentalism actually started out as a religious movement. Yeah, it did. Okay. It is a kind of pantheism, and it even has its own holiday. Holiday means holy day. The major holiday for New Age environmentalism or pantheism is called Earth Day. And the first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970 when they all declared that we would all be dead and burned up by now. So good luck. Way to go. You're still alive. They had all kinds of theories. The earth is too hot. The earth is too cold. The climate is changing. The weather is changing. Everything's going to die. We aren't going to be able to breathe. We're going to have to wear gas masks. Everything's going to die. We're going to blow each other up with nuclear bombs. They had all of these things that they presented as fact, and none of it happened. Okay. Now, conservatism, conservation, they go together. Okay? This stuff, environmentalism, is not the same thing as conservation. Conservation is not the same thing as what they were teaching, okay? Conservation is a good thing. It's the practice of wise stewardship of our nation's natural resources. People want things to be nice and clean. Guess who didn't want things to be nice and clean? The counterculture, the hippies, okay? But they went after big businesses instead. They said, okay, look, we'll litter, we'll poop in the street. We will live these awful lives, but we're going to go after you, big business, because you're polluting the waterways. Okay, I'm not saying that every big business was doing great, because they weren't. But instead of going after people and saying, we're going to charge you money for every time you don't do what the government says, how about instead using some of that cash that you are trying to spend to punish people to help them make their jobs better, easier, more realistic? So for a lot of companies, when it was, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency was formed, a lot of companies were looking at the information about the fallout, like how much pollution they were putting in the air. You know what a lot of companies did? They put filters onto their systems to prevent that. And that stopped a lot of the pollution. But here's the thing. A lot of people don't know what the fallout is until they're told. So they were told and they fixed the problem, but people aren't going to be happy because they look at business, big business especially, as being part of the culture and their counterculture. Okay, here's the problem when you get into political environmentalism. A lot of people aren't very, they don't pay enough attention to what's actually happening. So political environmentalism actually views mankind as the enemy of nature. And its whole goal is to pass laws that hurt private property, individuals, and businesses. And they want to hinder the advance of technology in an effort to protect nature at the cost of mankind. However, if you stop with those punishment laws and allow people to keep their money and say, look, this is a better, more efficient way to do your business, people are willing to do that. They're willing to recycle if it's a little more, if it's easier for them, okay? If it makes more sense, sure. So yeah, sometimes people who are big into political environmentalism don't always get the whole story. So a lot of the electric cars, they're incredibly, incredibly expensive. It's not always easy to find a place where you can charge your car, although it's much more available now than it ever has been before. But people using these electric or battery operated cars, they have to recharge their cars with electricity, and the electricity comes from the same sources that they are protesting against. So coal and fossil fuels, well, coal is a fossil fuel, but coal and other fossil fuels are all being used for these battery powered cars to charge them up. People started using a lot of hydroelectric power, which is totally non-polluting, but then they start complaining about that because they said it hurts the environment in which the dam is built. Okay, so you can't have everything. You just can't. But they are just so anxious to stop everybody from doing anything at all that would be favorable to human life. Okay. Now, Nixon, when he became president, he promised to get America out of Vietnam by training the South Vietnamese to fight for themselves. And everybody's like, okay. But actually, the majority of people were like, we don't believe you. We hate you. They were already mad at LBJ because he didn't stop the Vietnam War. And then Nixon said, okay, well, I'm going to get them out of Vietnam. And they said, yeah, but you're a Republican, so we're going to hate you anyway. Okay, 1969, Nixon did begin withdrawing American troops from South Vietnam. Now, here's the other side of the story. He also sent troops to Laos and Cambodia, which are bordering Vietnam, to discover where the supply line started. Remember, they were using that Ho Chi Minh Trail, and the South Vietnamese could not defend themselves when they were constantly being snuck up on by people using the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So Nixon sent people into Laos and Cambodia to discover the beginnings of that trail and to also figure out if communists in those countries were actually supporting North Vietnam from outside. Turns out, yes, they were. So here was his war strategy. Vietnamization. That is so hard to say, but it's just the policy to end U.S. involvement in the war, to shift the entire burden of the war to South Vietnamese so they could take care of it themselves. And he promised public de-escalation of the war. We're going to get our men out. They can just start fighting their own stuff. This helped him win the 1968 election. Okay, so this is the re-election. He privately promised South Vietnam he would escalate the conflict. That was found in the Pentagon Papers, and the New York Times found out the U.S. citizens began to mistrust U.S. government. Began to mistrust the U.S. government? They were anti-U.S. government long before this, but now they had a new person to focus on. Now, when he talks about that escalation of conflict, he's talking specifically about doing a last push to get those the communists under control before the United States left. Okay, and sending troops into Laos and Cambodia. Okay, guys, that's where we're going to stop for right now. I'm going to take a quick break, and then I'm going to do another lecture, and I will talk to you then.